All right, today we're going to talk about the Sandmarc variable ND filter for the GoPro 9 and 10. Now, if you watch my channel, you see that I do a lot of outdoor stuff, a lot of canyoneering, hiking, scrambling, that sort of thing. So the best option for me to take is the GoPro. So like any camera, it has its strengths and its weaknesses. The main strengths in the GoPro are it's an action cam. It's made for this rugged outdoorsy stuff. It's waterproof, it's shockproof, it's tiny, it's easy to carry around. It has different mounts you can use. Whereas my full frame camera, I'm not taking it into a canyon and swimming around. It would get wrecked. It also has a lot of customization that you can do in the settings to make the image better. But since it's so small, it doesn't have that full frame. So it's not going to give you as good quality an image as, say, my Canon EOS R. So you take the weaknesses of the GoPro, you weigh them against the strengths, and overall it's worth it. But it could be improved upon. That's where the ND filter comes in. Now, if you're very familiar with cameras and you know all the basics, you can fast forward to here, and I'll get more into the review of the ND filter itself. But I want to take a minute and kind of explain what is an ND filter and how does a camera work and what's the point of using one. So I'm going to geek out on cameras here for a minute. Just bear with me. So what is an ND filter? An ND filter is basically like a set of sunglasses for your camera. It goes over the lens and it reduces the amount of light that can get in there. Why do you care about that? Well, you know, the amount of light, that's all related to exposure, whether you're going to be overexposed, underexposed, but the camera itself also can handle that. There are several ways to handle exposure with a camera. So first you have ISO. ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. It's really more for darker situations than lighter, and we're going to talk more about overexposure than underexposure. So your ISO, basically, when you see star photos and stuff like that, that's the low light condition that you use ISO. You set your camera at a high ISO, that little bit of light can still be detected. Whereas if you're at a low ISO, it's just going to be a black screen if you try to photograph the night sky. So ISO doesn't help me for what I do most of the time, which is hiking during the day. And, you know, I don't do this for a living. I do this as a hobby. And I'm out here first to hike, second to film. So I have a limited amount of time and I have to be where I need to be when I need to get there. If the sun is, you know, at high noon, there's going to be more light. Everything's going to be super bright and your camera has to compensate for that. ISO doesn't help. The other thing is aperture. So you look at aperture, it's kind of like the iris of your eye. You go outside, your eyes get tighter. You go inside, they open up. It lets more or less light in that way. The GoPro is a fixed aperture. So it's set at, I think it's f2.8. You can't change that. So you can't tighten that down to let less light in. So ISO, aperture, off the table. That just leaves shutter speed. Shutter speed, think of it as opening and closing your eye. That's basically a shutter. It comes open, lets light in, shuts, stops the light from coming in. That takes a picture. And video is just a series of pictures. Think of one of those old flip books, if you're old enough to remember those. I don't know if they're around anymore. It's a bunch of still pictures, you flip through it, and it looks like it's got motion. That's basically video. How many of those pictures are in a second is called frame rate. But without going too far into frame rate, the most cinematic frame rate, the one that is most pleasing to the human eye, is 24p. I'm going to call it frames per second. They used to say 24 frames per second, 60 frames per second. Now they've changed that to p. I don't know why they did that. That's confusing. So 24 frames per second. That means there are 24 of those still photos per second of video. So why do you care about that? Well, it's about motion blur. Your eye, if you go like that, it doesn't see these still pictures of that hand moving back and forth. So if you think about it, if there are 120 of those frames per second, this hand moves a shorter amount of time. Why am I talking in the rhythm of this hand moves a... If my hand moves across here in 1 second, if you take 60 frames per second, each picture is going to be less motion of my hand. What that does is when you play it back, it's a very crisp image of the hand. Now, if you take let's say you did 2 frames a second. The first frame would be my hand going from here to here. The next would be from here to here. So you would have that much blur of my hand in the picture. You know, you take a picture and it's too dark, and you're taking a picture of something running, it's blurry. That's basically what you want to do with any kind of motion in your video, but you want it to be the right amount of blur, not the blurry where you're looking at it and you're saying, what am I looking at? So how do you achieve that perfect amount of blur for your video? There's a rule in videography that you want to set your shutter speed to double what your frame rate is. So if your ideal frame rate is 24 frames per second, your shutter speed wants to be 1/48th of a second. So every 1/48th of a second, it will take 1 picture. That will give you the most cinematic, natural looking image to the eye when you're watching the video. The problem is the only way to set that exposure on your GoPro is to put the shutter speed to auto. So if it's really bright, it does a super fast shutter speed. If it's darker, it does a slower one. That messes up that image. It'll look crisp as your hand moves across or whatever motion you have, and that looks jittery and unnatural. If I want to set my shutter speed to fixed and it's too bright and I have no other way to control exposure on the GoPro, this is what's going to happen. Yeah, a little bright, a little overexposed. In order to fix that, I need one of these, which is an ND filter. There you go. Put sunglasses on your camera, and now I can have the shutter speed to get that motion blur, and I can also have the right exposure. So I used ND filters in the past, and I've just kind of stopped because they were fixed. You think about sunglasses in varying degrees, lightest to darkest, and they would have ND4, ND8, ND16, ND32, 64. The higher the number, the darker they are. So, you know, the clouds are going by right now, which is a great example. If I'm out trying to film something, the lighting conditions change. I constantly have to reach into the bag. Okay, it's brighter now. I need the ND32. It's darker now. I need the ND8. And you'd have to switch back and forth. And eventually I just said, look, it's not worth the trouble. I'm not going to do it. That's where the Sandmarc comes in. All I have to do, if I want to adjust the exposure, is go like this. It is a variable ND filter that goes from ND8 all the way up to ND64. So you can just adjust on the fly. Being that convenient, I'll actually use this because when I'm filming out here, like I said earlier, I have places to go. I don't have that time to set up every single shot to be perfect. Something like this, I can get a better quality image out of my GoPro, and I can do it on the fly, so it's fast enough. Now, it is an extra step. You've got to turn on your GoPro, set the exposure, get the shot going, or just start shooting and then adjust as you go, get it perfect, and then use that part of the clip. But it's only one extra step. And for me, that's worth it. That is the very long story of why I would want to use the Sandmarc ND filter. Anyway, I'm going to switch to my Canon and sit down and kind of walk through some of the things I like about it, some of the things I don't. I'm going to shoot some footage with this GoPro with the ND filter and this one without the ND filter. Put the images together on the timeline when I get home, and we can all decide what we think of the image. All right, I'm going to go set up the camera and we'll talk about this more. All right, so what are my thoughts? Build quality, solid. This is metal, this is glass. The back part, I believe, is plastic, but it needs to be to get that friction fit onto the GoPro lens cover. I've had no issues with it coming off and on. I don't think that it's going to come off of there unless you dropped it. I did have a separate one of these on my GoPro that wasn't a GoPro brand, and it almost pulled that one off when I took it off. But for the GoPro one, easy install, sturdy, pretty easy removal. As far as performance, I love the variable ND. I don't have to worry about taking this off, putting another fixed one on, getting it out of my pack. That's a game changer for me. I will start using this. That being said, this is glass, this is metal. This adds a layer of fragileness to the GoPro that I don't normally have, and I said at the beginning that I like this because it's rugged. So there's a lot of hikes when they get more extreme or canyoneering, I'm not going to use this because I'm hard on GoPros. Now what I don't like, it can get dirty. I mean, it's a pretty big lens. I'm used to the GoPro, I just wipe it on my sleeve, keep going. Keeping that clean is going to be a concern. I wish they had a cover that went on this. It comes with a carrying case, but it doesn't have that lens cap cover. Now that would just add a layer of complexity, which I don't like. I want it simple so I can get the shot, but keeping it clean, I'm gonna have to have a microfiber towel or something. So another issue that I have is you have to set the exposure based on this image or the screen on the front, which it partially obscures with the filter. If you're young and you can see really well, that's probably not an issue. When you get old like me, you're gonna have to have some of these handy to really know you nailed that exposure. So price-wise, for a set of ND filters fixed from ND8 all the way up to 64, I forget the price on this, I don't have it with me. It's either $30 or $60. I'll put a comparison here of a decent set of fixed ND, but with this, you need a different exposure. You just turn it. Otherwise, you take the fixed filter off, you dig through your bag, you get the right one, you put it on, and that's a hassle. So this is worth it to me. What else? I mean, you know, it's an added cost. It's another piece of equipment. It adds that extra step of dealing with the exposure. But like I said, those little increments of improvement make for a much better overall product in your video. So it's worth it for me. I won't use it every single time, but I'm actually getting ahead of myself. It may be worth it for me. I've got to get home, put all this stuff on the timeline and see what does the video look like. Filters can cause discoloration, they can cause blurriness, loss of quality of image. If it does any of that, then it's definitely not worth it. So I think I'm done out here. I'm gonna pack this up, go run a couple of canyons, get home, put this video together, put the images side by side and see how it looks. See you then. Okay, I forgot to say, Sandmarc sent me the filter free of charge in exchange for the review. I get no further compensation. I always do that with my reviews because I want to be as honest as I can with you. So I really don't give a shit if I say good things or bad things about this. I'll just tell you how it is and how I feel about it, and then you can decide if you want to get it or not. I feel like an idiot. Try it walking. All right, so got home, had a chance to go through the footage, and the results are interesting. So on the first clip, motion blur, very obvious. You can see that in the still. The detail, I feel like it's pretty much similar with or without the ND filter. And finally, I like the exposure and the color better with the ND filter. So the second clip, I like the exposure better with the ND filter, but it was shaky. It was surprising to me. I didn't expect that. More on that later. Third clip, I missed the exposure on the ND filter. It was a little overexposed, I feel like. That goes back to the whole having to see the exposure on that tiny screen. But motion blur, I thought that looked really good. Colors, everything else, details looked pretty much the same between the two different with and without the ND filter. So on the fourth clip, really shaky again compared to no ND filter. Everything else I felt was pretty similar. It did have the motion blur and that cinematic look to it. So overall, the performance I like, the appearance, details, no discoloration, gives that cinematic look, but that shakiness bugs me. So when I got home, looked at it, saw this, I figured, all right, I'm gonna do a couple more tests. So I took it out just now in the neighborhood and did some tests with no ND filter and then ND8 all the way up to 64. When I shot it out in the woods, I had it on boost instead of just the hyper smooth. So I wanted to check that. And I checked with auto shutter speed all the way to the 1/48. Here's what happened there. Yeah, so you can see as the ND filter goes up, the shots get progressively more shaky. So something to take into account, and it really is kind of a big deal to me. I mean, when I was shooting this, I was purposefully trying to walk uneven and, be a little bit shaky to see if that hyper smooth was going to do its thing. And it did without the ND filter. It did okay with the ND8, and then as you went up to the ND64, it eventually got pretty shaky. So what I take away from this is it's a pretty specialized piece of equipment. It's not something that you're just going to slap on your camera, crank it up to ND64 and take off running and get good footage. That shakiness is going to ruin that footage. But if you've got it sitting there and you're filming something, the camera's stationary, it's going to get that cinematic feel, and it does a great job at that. Now, I want you to keep in mind I shot this under the harshest of harsh conditions. This is not good lighting, a whole other story, but I wanted to test under these hard conditions. So yeah, I mean, it's just like everything else. Like I was saying at the beginning, the GoPro's got its strengths, it's got its weaknesses. You use it for what it's best suited for. The variable ND filter from Sandmarc, no difference. It's great for certain circumstances, like a stationary camera where you have motion that you're recording, and it's not so good for other ones like high action type of stuff that's really going to be rough on the camera, or where the camera's got a lot of movement to it and you're trying to get a steady shot. So overall, high quality device, does what it's supposed to, has some drawbacks. You got to weigh the pros and cons and decide if it's right for you. Anyway, that's all I got. Hopefully this was helpful. Thanks for bearing with me while I geeked out about cameras, and we're done here.